What if everything you thought you knew about the Middle Ages was completely wrong? For decades, historians and students alike operated under the assumption that the defining feature of the medieval era was a neat and tidy social pyramid. This structure, known as feudalism, was believed to have governed every aspect of life, from politics and warfare to economics and law, with a clear hierarchy of lords and vassals. But as modern research pushes the boundaries of our understanding, a surprising truth has emerged. This simple, elegant system might be nothing more than a historical illusion. Welcome to our journey, where we will unravel the myth of the feudal system and reveal how our perception of the Middle Ages has been fundamentally reshaped. But before we deconstruct the modern view, let's first examine the model that dominated academic thought for nearly a century. This classical theory of feudalism, which emerged in the early 1900s, was a cornerstone of university education well into the 1980s. It held that the feudal system first appeared in the 8th century under the powerful Carolingian dynasty. According to this model, it was a fusion of two distinct traditions: the Roman practice of commendation and the loyalty oaths of early Germanic warriors. The Latin term se commender, meaning to entrust oneself to someone, described a practice in which a free man would seek protection from a powerful patron, offering his service and obedience in exchange for security. Although this arrangement was often the result of unfavorable circumstances, it was a common and essential part of life in the late Roman and early medieval periods. The second element, the oath sworn by a warrior to a chieftain, was also a core part of this theory. While once believed to be a purely Germanic custom, it was more likely a practice adopted from Roman military oaths, which Germanic peoples first encountered while serving in the empire's legions. These two forms of personal allegiance were believed to have formed the bedrock of medieval vassalage. So, how did this personal bond become a system? That's where land enters the story. Scholars long assumed that the material component of feudalism, the fief, was a widespread practice in the 8th and 9th centuries. They believed these fiefs were referenced in historical documents under the legal term beneficium. Most beneficia were essentially a type of loan called a precarium, which allowed a person to temporarily use someone else's property, typically land, without gaining ownership. The flexibility of these arrangements created powerful social ties between two parties. However, older scholarship interpreted these precarium loans in a very specific way, translating most of them simply as fiefs that a lord granted to a vassal in return for military service. In this view, the personal bonds of loyalty, combined with the granting of land and the chaos of the 8th century, provided the perfect catalyst for a new, powerful system to emerge. But what drove this change? The most common explanation centered on the rise of cavalry. The Frankish army, a force of peasant foot soldiers, was no match for the swift, agile cavalry of their Arabian and Avar rivals. Furthermore, they needed a rapid reaction force to counter the brutal raids of the Norsemen. The solution was the mounted armored horsemen. As this new cavalry was more expensive to equip and train than the old peasant army, they required more material resources. This is where the practice of granting fiefs was believed to have intensified. The old theory suggested that the great Frankish ruler, Charles Martel, had confiscated large tracts of land from the church and issued it as fiefs to his men, binding them to him as vassi, or vassals. When his sons, Pippin the Younger and Carloman, sought to return the requisitioned property to the church, a clever solution was devised. The church received the land back, but was immediately forced to hand it over to the vassi as precarium loans, ensuring the Frankish king retained their military service. This model quickly spread, and secular lords and church officials began to adopt it. They gave land to their own subordinates, creating a system of sub-fiefs. It was even believed that offices, such as those of bishops and counts, were tied to the king through this hierarchical structure. Thus, The early medieval world under the Carolingians was believed to have become a feudal society, and as fiefs became hereditary, the king's power waned, giving rise to the complex, fragmented kingdoms of the High Middle Ages. But in 1994, all of this changed. The publication of British historian Susan Reynolds's groundbreaking work, Fiefs and Vassals. The medieval evidence, reinterpreted, presented a new perspective that shook the historical world. Reynolds argued that previous research had often interpreted the terminology found in early medieval sources too narrowly. She pointed out that words such as vassal and fief were far less common in the historical record than was previously believed. Furthermore, when they did appear, they did not automatically imply a system of military service exchanged for land. Yet, this is exactly how older research had interpreted them, often translating terms in a one-sided way to fit the established model. The issue was even more complex than that. Reynolds showed that words like fideles, confidant, and homines were often used by older researchers as synonyms for vassals without considering their true meaning and context within the documents. In reality, the sources themselves were often quite clear, distinguishing between these different terms and rarely depicting them as part of a neat lord-vassal relationship. The term beneficium was equally ambiguous, encompassing a wide range of practices, as its basic meaning was simply a benefit. Some historians in the 1930s and 40s were aware of this ambiguity. They undertook the step of excluding all beneficia related to peasants from their analysis, because these so-called peasant fiefs did not fit the knightly or vassal model they were trying to construct. This artificial separation of the sources led to a severely limited understanding of the terms. It also ignored the immense regional diversity and local traditions that defined early medieval Europe. What a person served for and what a beneficium was received for was often not as simple as the feudal model made it out to be. Furthermore, Reynolds and later historians showed that some of the fundamental assumptions of the older research were not as strongly proven as they seemed. For example, the assertion that Charles Martel had confiscated church property on a large scale is not supported by the sources. The story of Pippin and Carloman returning the land is not based on a broad practice, but rather on the results of a single synod held in 743 or 744. This synod merely mentioned the connection between military service and precarium loans, but only for an impending war, not as a widespread long-term system. What's more, the idea that bishops, dukes, and counts were bound to the king as vassals is based on a flimsy foundation. Throughout the Carolingian period, sources strictly differentiated between the king's vassals and his high-ranking officials. It was only in the 12th and 13th centuries that the binding of office to a corresponding fief emerged as part of a more institutionalized state. In fact, the German historian Roman Deutinger could not find a single instance of a sub-vassal in the 8th and 9th century sources. So, as we have seen, the historical reality contained in the early medieval sources was far more complex and diverse than the older theories. The concept of feudalism is simply unable to capture it. As Roman Deutinger put it so eloquently, a system that allows a myriad of exceptions and can only be proven in a few individual cases is no longer a system, but simply a fiction. Today, historians no longer view the Carolingian Empire as a centralized state, defined by a feudal system. Instead, they see a world of diverse, flexible personal relationships that contemporaries skillfully and strategically employed. So, if feudalism didn't originate here, where did it come from? According to Susan Reynolds and others, the true origin of feudalism lies in northern Italy in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. It was here that a new class of lawyers and jurists, inspired by the clarity and structure of Roman law, began to organize, categorize, and regulate the messy reality of medieval life. They sought to formalize practices of inheritance, land loans, military duty, and loyalty. In these legal texts, they tried to create a strong, unambiguous link between a fief and vassalage. Their goal was to reduce the number of legal conflicts and make their own work easier by establishing clear, normative principles. These lawyers created the strict categories and terms of lords and vassals, which were then codified and spread across Europe through the increasing use of written law. Later, in the 16th century, other legal experts specializing in feudal law rediscovered these texts and used them to explain the entire medieval world as a single uniform system. Finally, the historians of the 19th century adopted this early modern picture as their own, painting the Middle Ages as a feudal age. This reveals a profound truth. The common idea of a universal feudal system was, in fact, an intellectual construct born in a legal setting, not a historical reality on the ground. Where does this leave us today? Most historians now follow Reynolds's compelling critique. They are using more source-oriented terminology to more accurately describe the practices of the early and high Middle Ages. Furthermore, regional studies have become a staple of research, as historians seek to understand the unique local contexts of fiefdoms, land loans, and personal relationships. After all, the lending of land, offices, and property rights remains a defining phenomenon in medieval European history. But it's a phenomenon that defies simple categorization. This video is just one example of how the past is a living, evolving field of study. We hope this journey into the world of historical misconceptions has been as captivating for you as it was for us. The content you've just watched is based on extensive research from respected historians, with references appearing on screen for you to explore further. Your support allows us to continue making history both informative and entertaining. If you found this video fascinating, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with others who love to learn. Stay tuned for our next story.